Okay, it's great. It is almost 2. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the THEM 12, Urban Critical Infrastructure Protection, and in particular to Panel 2 for Standardization on Urban Critical Infrastructure Protection and Disaster Resilience. Thank you for being here with us after the wonderful lunch break. My name is Katerini Poustouli. I'm working in the unit B4 of DG Home, Innovation and Industry for Security, and I'm dealing with standardization issues. Allow me to say a few words for myself. I have a university degree in industrial engineering from the Technical University of Crete in Greece and a PhD in robust quality engineering from the National Technical University of Athens. A career path in consultant services, testing laboratories, standardization, industry, ISO management standard systems auditing, academia and public administration led me to the European Commission and to Joint Research Center for 2 years. Afterwards, I moved in Brussels, and where I undertook the duties in B4, in Unit B4 in February 2017. During the morning session, we had the opportunity to be aware about different definitions of resilience and to understand how different types of resilience management guidelines for critical infrastructures can engage end users. In panel 2, we will share insights and we will exchange knowledge and good practices with stakeholders as representatives from critical infrastructure and disaster resilient projects and standardization organizations. Well, let's see some key points with regard to the panel for standardization on urban critical infrastructure and disaster resilience. The majority of us, we are well aware about the standardization process. We know that standardization is a common language which linked with principles like trust, reliability, interoperability, innovation. Standards exist principally to provide a reliable basis on which common expectations can be shared regarding specific characteristics of a product, service, system, or process. These common expectations can meet under the involvement of all the security stakeholders and specificities such as confidentiality and the security rules for protecting European classified information, especially when produced under the pre-normative work of projects under the Horizon 2020. Many times, extreme conditions like terrorist actions, radicalization, natural and man-made disaster are indicating the consideration of reviewing and accelerating the standardization processes. A big number of research projects are produced and are producing exceptional results that could take the form of technical specifications, workshop agreements, or other standardization documents. This scientific evidence for policymaking supports the cycle of established mandates, decisions, communications, and prioritization of actions on funding mechanisms like Horizon 2020 and FP7. The European Agenda on Security underlined that a competitive European security industry can contribute to the European autonomy in meeting security needs. Despite being among the world leaders in many segments on the security sector, the main exchange of the European industry is its highly fragmented nature, for example, the lack of harmonized standards and certification procedures. Divergent approaches have effectively led to the creation of at least 28 different security markets split into a large number of security sectors. In this overall context, one of the central concerns is difficulty for industry to predict whether there will be some market use of the research results. This leads to potentiality promising research and development concepts, yet not being explored any further. Consequently, certain technologies could improve security are not available to the demand side. Innovation policies, like the ones related to the certification scheme for the aviation equipment and the cybersecurity certification scheme, could harnessing also to other security domains. Several questions are raised under the above thoughts, and our guest speakers will enlighten aspects of these issues based on their findings. In the slide, we see an indicative list of questions, not exhaustive, which reflected on some aspects that we will attempt to approach today in our panel. So these questions are, for example, why standardization, who are the actors, which are the deliverables, how standardization or conformity assessment or harmonization could contribute to urban CIP and DRS, if harmonization is the key to support the policy making, the member states and the European Union market, how research deliverables on these domains contribute to the security standardization, how the practitioners' involvement are, let's say, satisfied until now, which areas on standardization could support these efforts for European certifications in, for example, in the CBRN area. Is it urgent? Do we need something, or do we need it now? Could public-private partnership could support the whole effort? And what will be the way forward? After the presentations, a discussion between the panelists will follow. And then we invite you to interact, to address your questions, your recommendation, and your insights for the topics presented. We do have some change. There will not be a poster session, so the last two presentations, the last two speeches will integrate with the main panel too. So Mr. Georgios Karagiannis and Maciej Kocenski will join with us, and they will provide two extra presentations on the GRC multidisciplinary approach to urban CIP and to EPSIP, the European Programme for Critical Infrastructure Protection. So a last round of questions will follow, and we will sum up with the conclusions of the THEM 12. In this very special moment, I'm, let's say, very pleasant to say that we are very happy to welcome the Madam Chair, the Chairwoman of Panel 2, Mrs. Silvia Vaccaro. So Silvia Vaccaro has a university degree in industrial engineering from the Politecnico di Milano, Italy, and a master's degree in international politics and trade from the Sydney University in Australia. She works in the unit of the European Commission DG CoU, dealing with standardization issues, responsible for international relations with countries outside the European Union. Her tasks focus on collaboration with organizations like the World Trade Organization, the United Nations Economic Commission for European Working Party, especially on the regulatory cooperation and standardization policies, with many other organizations in Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and also in the new action of DG CoU, the Joint Initiative on Standardization. She worked several years in CENELEC, the European Standardization Organizations, as responsible for international cooperation. So Silvia, we welcome you. We are very happy to have you. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. As you heard from my short CV, I'm not really an expert in whatever you're discussing here. So I found it incredibly interesting this morning because this is a classical example of where we need standardization. Being an outsider and listening to the fact that there are 300 definitions of resilience that made my hair stand up straight. So I think that indeed standardization is crucial in this area, and I'm very hopeful that the discussions today will bring some substance to this. Also because as European Commission and especially as a unit dealing with standardization, we always try to see standardization as an incredible tool, not only to gain market access, but also to gain trust of consumers, to gain trust of citizens. And the higher level we go, the better. So it's better to work first and straight away at the international level, if that's not possible at European level, but definitely have 28 different markets for what we are talking about is a waste of resources and is definitely not an efficient way of going about. And with that, I will keep it very short and stop here. I will introduce the first panelist, Alexander Jovanovic, which is the CEO of the European Institute for Integrated Risk Management, director of Steinbell's Advanced Risk Technology Group, and a professor, as well as convener of 3 CWAs, 1 DIN specification, 1 EN, and 1 ISO, all in the area of risk resilience and new technology. So we definitely have deal with a very good expert, and we're looking forward to his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Silvia. So it's always a big danger to come and talk after such an introduction. You know, the introduction raises expectations very high, and you don't know how one is going to meet them. So I hope that in that what I'm going to present to you today, you are not going to be afraid by the long title. It's not the whole presentation which I put in the title, but almost. But in principle, I'll be talking about 2 worlds and 2 ways of doing and dealing with standardization. And these, as I call them here, 2 worlds, and 2 words also in a way, are creating something which is very natural. If you have 2 sides in the nature, that if you have 2 sides of the same river, you have to make a bridge in between. And I think we are in a big need of making not only that one bridge, but also other bridges too. I would also encourage you to disregard many of the slides and think about the questions and discussions, because in this area of standardization, we are not talking about off-the-shelf, ready-made solutions. We cannot say this is good, this is bad, but we can say this is a good example of what has been done, or this is a good concept or initiative to be taken for the future. So in principle, Ekaterini has already shown a long list of questions, and I hope you have used the time while she was speaking to go through it. And some of these you will find also on my slides, thinking about what are the ideas behind the projects, how our deliverables from the projects can contribute to this, what we are doing in the area of standardization. But as I mentioned, all these questions actually, although numerous, don't have one single answer. They have several answers, and I think the podia like this, the situations in which we can exchange our opinions and ideas, can help us find the right dynamic bridges, I would call them this. At that point, I would just remind you about one thing which was also mentioned by Silvia. Obviously, our so to say, both Italian and Anglo-Saxon part of the CV brings us to the very similar thoughts. When she was talking about her hairs going up due to the many activities, I would just mention that the largest society in the world in the area of risk is the Society for Risk Assessment, for Risk Analysis. This society, of course, has a group which is working on terminology. Nice. ISO TC, standardization TC 262, has just created a working group with the convener from France, and which is going to be, secretariat is going to be made by French, AFNOR. Guess what? About terminology. And in every of our European projects, in one or the other ways, you will find a glossary. So you don't think that this is something which is showing that in this situation, we have to act, we have to do something. We have, of course, also there 2 possibilities to say, well, this is the definition and this is the definition. The other thing is to try to operate all this with new concepts, which we hope to develop also in our international and national organizations, for instance, with DIN. And this concept must be network-based. So we must have to live in a dynamic world of definitions, and instead of insisting on the right or the wrong one, insist on how do they relate and how we can transform one to another. So that was a small digression from the main topic which I wanted to cover, and this main topic is essentially talking about 2 types of standards. That is something which we regularly fall into a very vivid discussion. It's also a typical discussion for after 11 p.m. in the evening, after a good dinner and some wine, where the people start discussing how the hell I added, you think to standardize something which we are still discussing about. That is my standard up front on the right side. On the other side, you have the others who say, how, again, the hell you think that once established a standard has to prevent development, competitiveness, further research in one area. And this is all because we very often fail to understand that the original standardization, the one which we had, so to say, before, was about experts. This was something where people, for instance, on the left side, I hope that this is going to work. Yeah, what you see here is a pressure vessel. Very stupid thing. You know, a lot of energy stored in one place. At the early years of 20th centuries, things were exploding very much, especially in the United States. And they have created ASME, American Society of Mechanical Engineers. The guys produced the standard and so on. We have followed this way. And of course, we have our European standards here, EN 13345, which do more or less the same thing. And they are also covered by some regulation. If you compare the results out of this, and there were projects on this, what you see, the results are different. But there is one thing. These results are explainable. These results can be, so to say, drilled down in the sense that we can always see where the differences come from. And there is a bunch of very qualified experts who talk about these things without being, so to say, I put it under the quotation mark, bothered by the rest of the society. And it is possible because it's highly technical issues. If you look at the things which I've borrowed from one of Katerina's presentations, it was the same with various other things, you know, which are very telegraph-oriented or very technical-oriented. On the other side, we have things like that. You talk about standards in the 31,000 series, in the 14,000 series, talking about ISO standards. You talk about 26,000, and you will find no formula. You will find drawings. You will find principles, concepts, criteria, frameworks. And that is something where, so to say, the discussion or the field for the discussion is wider. That is a place where the opinions have to be, so to say, justified, and also justified by the fact on whose behalf are they made. Because there is, as I say, not only physics behind these things, there is also society behind these things. And that would be, you know, where our standards of type 1 and standards of type 2 fall on by now sort of a well-established presentation of how do we deal with new uncertain things in the area of governance, but also in the area of standardization consider it as a part of overall governance, where on the left side, for simple problems, I mean, it doesn't, when I say simple problem, it doesn't mean that the formula for calculating exact wall thickness of a very complex pressure vessel is simple. It simply means that the way to finding this result and to find a critical value is simple because it's not burdened by anything like those which you see on the right side. Complexity, uncertainty, ambiguous character, and these things essentially mean that when you deal with a simple problem, like this one, technical problem, you are able to standardize it very well. You don't have too much discussion, and the experts are those who are dealing with the matter most of the time. As you move to the other side, as the problems start being complicated in the sense that you don't have good input values, that you don't know about them, that the opinions of experts starts differing, there you start to, so to say, look at the whole problem differently, apart from agency staff, which is included in all of these things, and we have here nice representatives of all our agencies, national standardization bodies, and so on. We have to include not only scientists and researchers, which we have here also in this room too, but all affected stakeholders, and in the most extreme cases, the whole society. Because what we do with a sort of new complex risk for instance, looming somewhere in the background. That is something which is not concerning only the expert who is maybe making money because he is the only expert for this system. So that all, such an approach leads us to that what is our common goal here, and this is resilience. In this context, I would just like to mention one thing which is slightly a paradox, especially in Europe. We have dealt with a system which was containing technology, management, culture, and behavior. In each of these cases, we have made significant improvement in the last years. Look at the statistics. There is a book in Germany which is called Everything Was Worse Before. No, everything was better before. But the book is essentially showing that everything was worse, or more or less everything was worse before. It's worth reading because it shows that we actually, in technology, have made really significant progress. In safety management, if we look at it, we have done the same. But what happens with the public societal perception of that what we are doing? It was not following the same stuff. It was essentially talking about risks of fracking, risk of nanotechnologies, risk of this, as if it was a religion, as if there was no science in the background. So that is where our standards of the second type can help us, and that is the word which I gladly heard several times mentioned today, which is trust gap. And if you talk about this and you look at the flowchart which is here, which is essentially borrowed and modified from one of the TED Talks, you will see that the invention of the printing machine has closed one big gap in the society. This was the gap of knowledge. People needed to have the knowledge widespread, and that is why they have actually managed to do it by printing books. Later on, in the time of Industrial Revolution, other inventions helped us manage other gaps: energy, power, manufacturing, you name it. Recently, with the explosion, we have managed one way or the other to manage the information gap. But the gap of the 21st century, which is still open and not closed, it's the gap of trust. If you don't believe me, you just go and see what happens with the Bitcoin. Bitcoin, blockchain technology, these technologies are here because we have a lack of trust and we have a need to have more trust and close the gap of trust. So that is one of the implicit, not so visible tasks which we have to address also in our effort, which is a sort of a reminder that in DRS projects we are dealing with pre-standardization. Many of the resistant projects, the roadmaps and other things were dealing with this. Pre-normative research in other projects. Standardization in CEN, you have heard about it. We have one single example of an ISO standard, being born now. And in principle, talking about the gap of trust, we see that in this area we probably need something which will lead us to GRI G4 of resilience. If you are confused with this acronym, you just go to the annual reports which big companies like BASF, Siemens, you name it, produce, and you will find that they, on a voluntary basis, at the end of each year, according to such a scheme, report how good they are in non-using, strange forms of exploitation, and how they care about the environment and all other things. So that is something which we have partly done, as I mentioned, in some of our activities. I mentioned here resistance issue, resistant project, which has produced quite a lot of stuff. New proposals are made on different in different projects, different actions, probably needing more alignment. Just a comment. And to conclude, in each of them, we would like and we try to solve some of the technical and other problems which are common for all problems, although not always recognized. I've taken out 3 problems which might have so to say, good solutions found in the practice so far, and that's where I'm going to finish. The first problem is the problem of time. So we, essentially have a time scale which is very different for a research project and a time scale for the standardization process. There is rarely a standardization process which is shorter than 4 years. 3 years nominal duration, you need a year to prepare everything if you are good. And after the standard is published again, you have or the work on the standard is finished, you need some time. So possible solution out of examples which I would like to see maybe examined also by the Commission and maybe examined as something as a possible solution. I will just bring here one example. In FP5, there was a project which didn't even have a name, it had only a number. And this continued in another project which is called DreamUp, which produced the CWA. CWA was produced in late 2010, so about 2007, published 2008. This was continued in the next project of the Commission, which prepared all the stuff for an EN standard. And this EN standard was published now, 2018, 1st of May. So something which was starting 1998, finished in 2018 with a series of actions, only because people were interested in this. By the way, this standard in itself, I will finish right off, was financed by the industry. 18 industrial companies have joined the European initiative, European projects, and did it. But you need a lot of stamina for this. The second example which I care mentioning is the so to say link between two large projects, Integrist producing a CWA and Smart Resilience working now on ISO. The last thing which I want to mention as an example is the need that we do things together in this. I mean, this is something which we always hear Commission saying to us as researchers. Project coordinators say, yes, we will do it, and then they start fighting with their only partners, days, schedules, everything else, and these things can sometimes fall short. Here what you see is one example of how we did it. I'm sorry that Sari is not here from SMR project, but Emanuele can say that their indicators found all from Resolute, found all places in Smart Resilience, but this is the part in which all the things which are coming from CWA 91, which René is going to talk about a little bit. We are going to talk about it. And the results and the indicators which they have collected were put in one tool. So that's, I think, where I would finish, putting a circle around all these activities, saying we have to go and try on the basis of the well-known principle, think big, talk big if you want also, but start small. And if we have a lot of these start small, the world will be better. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very interesting presentation about what's necessary in the world of resilience. Our next speaker is, and I'm sorry for the pronunciation, is George Karagiannis, who's a research scientist at the European Commission Joint Research Center. He's working on disaster risk management and critical infrastructure protection. He's a civil engineer and disaster risk manager with more than 10 years of experience and across the entire emergency management continuum in several European countries. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Ευχαριστώ, Κατερίνα. Grazie, Silvia, per l'introduzione. But that pretty much limits my knowledge of Italian. All right, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, I would like to take this time to present to you two of JRC's activities on standardization for critical infrastructure protection. However, before I go on, let me take a couple of, or maybe less than a minute, to present the JRC to you, for those of you who may not know what it is. So JRC stands for Joint Research Center. It is the European Commission's scientific facility Its purpose and mission is to support the European Union policy cycle with independent scientific evidence and advice as required. It has a staff of about 3,000 people, 3/4 of which are researchers and scientists, and engineers, I might add. We're dispersed in 6 sites, as you can see in this slide. Headquarters are located here in Belgium, but our largest campus is in Ispra, northern Italy, near Milan, where I actually live and work. The JRC started with a nuclear safety and security focus, but it has progressively expanded to several activities, including safety and security, but also sustainable development, economics, and even building safety. So the 2 activities I will discuss today fall under ERNCIP. ERNCIP stands for European Reference Network for Critical Infrastructure Protection. This is a bit counterintuitive, but I will return to ERNCIP in further detail in my other presentation. For the moment, let me just point out that ERNCIP is a network of security-related experts who essentially volunteer their time working on pre-standardization with a security product focus. ERNCIP has brought together experts from European institutions, of course academia, but also critical infrastructure operators, the industry, and other research facilities, and also member states. ERNCIP supports EU policy in several areas, one of which is the European Program for Critical Infrastructure Protection that my colleague Maciej will present later. But it has also supported, or is currently supported, the Action Plan for Enhancing Preparedness against chemical, biological, nuclear, and radiological nuclear threats, but also the work on explosives detection under the EU security agenda. One of the most important activities under ERNCIP are the thematic groups. Thematic groups are networks of European experts who, again, I would like to emphasize, volunteer their time to develop policy guidance or policy support according to predefined themes. On this slide, you can see the thematic groups that have either recently completed their work or are currently active. And today I would like to focus on 2 of them, namely early warning zones and the European Industrial Automation Control System Components Cybersecurity Certification Framework. Both of them are managed by my good colleague Alessandro Lazzari, who unfortunately could not make it here today, so he has asked me to fill in for him. The first one of these thematic groups is the Industrial Automation Control Systems Component Compliance and Certification Framework, or as we affectionately call it, ICCF. I'm just pointing that out because it's a bit counterintuitive. This thematic group is working on the feasibility of a European framework for the evaluation and certification of the cybersecurity of industrial automation control system components. The purpose is to harden the security of these components used by European critical infrastructure operators and at the same time foster mutual recognition of cybersecurity evaluation and certification. Due to the diversity of configurations of industrial automation control systems, the certification scheme produced by the thematic group has focused on the component level instead of the systems level. The group began by preparing a feasibility study for the establishment of a European certification scheme. This also supported DG Connect's work on certification of products and other services, and subsequently, the members of the thematic group conducted a broad stakeholder consultation to identify potential constraints and limitations to the feasibility of the network. The next report, this one, introduced the Industrial Automation Control System Component Cybersecurity Certification Framework, and proposed an initial set of common European guidelines to support the cybersecurity certification. It also made recommendations about the framework's governance, adoption, and implementation. At this stage, I would like to point out that, as its name implies, ICCF is a framework. It's not a standard, neither does it aim at the establishment of new standards. However, the group's work has supported DG Connect's impact assessment regarding ICT certification in Europe, and it has also provided input for the development of the new proposal for the regulation about ENISA, the European Network Information and Security Agency, right? Yep. The third phase of the thematic group's work was an assessment of the feasibility of the ICCF. I don't have the cover of the report because actually it's due for publication. It's in our internal publication system as we speak. The focus of that report, as I said, was on the assessment of the feasibility of the framework. The initial cybersecurity compliance and certification framework was applied on a voluntary basis in 5 member states through national level exercises. The lessons learned from these exercises were used to develop an updated framework, an updated version of the framework. Sorry. So in a nutshell, this framework is described in this chart. And in further detail, the framework includes 4 levels of certification, and I'm hardly an expert in the field, but as I understand it, the levels become progressively more strict, more austere, if you want, as we go from C1 to A. So C1 includes only self-declaration and compliance, whereas the first level includes a full certification, which also addresses the design of the product, including inter alia fail-safe designs and the like. You can you can download the report for further details. All the reports are available publicly, or at least the ones that have not been classified are available publicly on ERNCIP's website. You just have to Google ERNCIP and you'll get there. DG Connect have expressed interest in continuing the funding of this thematic group, which has just barely completed its work. They have told us that they're happy with the approach and they're looking to implement it if and where feasible to other areas beyond industrial automation and control systems. The second thematic group, which we call early warning zones, spawned from from a previous thematic group which addressed extended virtual fencing. And it focuses on the use of biometric and video technologies for critical infrastructure protection. The key point here was that recent incidents, which were directed at soft targets and attacks, that have caused casualties and damage at semi-public spaces, including critical infrastructure, have highlighted the need for identifying potential threats at a distance. Now, traditional security doctrine would simply suggest an additional perimeter with additional access points, but this may or may not be feasible, and when it is feasible, it simply offsets the perimeter, so it offsets the risk. Therefore, this thematic group was spawned from the realization that early identification of persons, objects, and even behaviors of interest could provide quicker alerts and expedite the deployment of countermeasures or measures to reduce the impact of those threats. The thematic group is focusing on biometric technologies, which provide the promise of such capabilities using a combination of methods. As I said, this is a relatively new thematic group. It's actually our newest one. It was commissioned in May 2017 by DG Home. It's in the beginnings of its work, and it endeavors to develop good practice guidance on strategies and actions to move from isolated short-range systems using simple biometric recognition to more complete solutions. The premise is that standard CCTV closed-circuit television feed can be used for direct biometric analysis, either by face or gait recognition or indirect recognition through behavioral biometric approaches. The group is currently working in describing the concept of operations through selected use cases for extended virtual boundaries. The use cases considered are including a metro station in an urban area and a secure site that includes nuclear facilities. I have not been too involved in this group, but I'm working in ISPRA, so I don't know where that second site is. Capability gaps will be assessed against technology trends to determine whether they can be addressed in the short term, and that will form the focus of subsequent work by this group. Specific topics will include the resolution and sensitivities of available technologies, including devices and algorithms, as well as the capability of biometric algorithms to find and identify persons of interest in wide-scale CCTV feeds. The important thing is that the experts have identified very quickly that video analytics and biometric technologies cannot by themselves provide a complete solution. They need to be combined with other capabilities, including artificial intelligence, robotics, and autonomous systems. At this point, it is important to point out that in terms of the available technology, we're nowhere near what you see on Jason Bourne and Mission Impossible. One study showed that one police force in the UK, which used similar technologies, had a 93% false positive rate. This begs two points. The first one is that public safety and law enforcement agencies need a very good process, need a very good procedure for handling a match. We really don't want police officers apprehending a 60 or 70-year-old lady with a cane and later having to tell her, okay, we thought you were somebody else. The second point is that the use of these technologies will create and is already creating the need to balance privacy with security. At this point, the group is assessing relevant legislation and European jurisprudence, but it is a matter of relatively vexing research. We're hoping, well, the trend right now, at least the way I perceive it, is that European citizens are relatively, very relatively, inclined to accepting a higher standard of security. But that remains a matter of debate, and I stand to be corrected here. However, we're hoping that the thematic group will help us to answer that question in well, much better. This completes my presentation. Well, this part of the presentation. I have only looked at a very small part of ERNSIP's work. I hope that I will be able to discuss what ERNSIP is and what it's doing as part of my next presentation. For the time being, thank you for bearing with me, and enjoy the rest.
Thank you very much. And we are going to our third and last speaker, René Lindner. He is a senior project manager at DIN, the German Institute for Standardization. And he has a high experience with the integration of standardization with the research and innovation projects, which is something quite relevant also to our joint initiative on standardization, with specific focus on security, resilience, and smart city-related topics. He's also the project coordinator at Bridget, in which the establishment of a stronger linkage between research and development community and standardization is the main objectives.
Thank you a lot, Sylvia. Well, I'm the last one of the panel to have the presentation, so I can somehow a bit conclude, at least in my first two minutes, a bit what we just have heard. Well, of course, I can thank you that you all think that standardization is an important element, especially when bringing different stakeholders together, and then they are able to develop together a document or a standard, which then can be disseminated around the world, because standardization system makes it possible. But the most important thing is that these standards which have been developed will be continuously revised. So not only to develop a document, it's being revised each couple of years. And the second one is, I call it SIT, S-I-T, about state-of-the-art, interested parties, and time. Because the first presentation, thank you, Sasha, for the comment, there's sometimes a bit of misunderstanding of standardization. So a standard is mentioning or listing the state-of-the-art on a specific field. Then, of course, if it's a well-established field, then it will be a European standard or international standard, because all interested parties are identified and could participate. But sometimes, if you have a new topic, a new field, of course, then you don't know often all the stakeholders. And then you start developing a standard like a SAN workshop agreement, which is more or less like an entrance point to a standardization system, having not participating all interested parties, but at least having a state-of-the-art in the new topic. And this brings me to the second point, interested parties. Of course, it's different between the different standardization documents we have. And in the end, the time. Well, of course, Sasha, you are right. The last years we have like 3-4 years was the time duration to develop a standard. But of course, we have, as standardization bodies, have seen this issue as well. And so we have like changed a bit our processes. And a normal European standard or international standard will now take more or less like 18 months. At least it's our ambitious for the next 2 years. So we're going a bit faster. And to develop a SAN workshop agreement, which is a tool for our research projects, it could take maybe 4 months actually, but you can also take 8 or 12 months. I have some examples of having a fast one and of a longer one. But now coming to my presentation actually. So standardization research innovation project, what does it mean actually for us? We have 3 different topics what we're actually doing normally in standardization. We have a standards research, we have standardization potential identification, and standards development in the end. Well, in the very beginning, of course, we try to identify the standards which are relevant to the topic, and then we'll distribute this information among the relevant project partners. And afterwards, we will try to identify with the partners within this project the potential for developing new standards, or maybe also give input to existing standards. And this also is an important point also to include the relevant technical committees which are existing on these topics. For example, in security, it's ISO TC 292, security and resilience, and on European level, synthesis 391. So these 2 ones are possible to do a liaison. It's called like a relationship between a project and the standardization committee in order to foster a bit also the uptake of the standardization potentials we could have in a project, and also the confirmation, more or less, I would say it, from the standardization side. And our last item we do normally in research project is, of course, we are a standardization body, we want to develop standards, that's our main purpose. But of course, when standards are existing already, we try to bring the input from the project into already existing standards. When they, as I said before, they'll be continuously updating, so we have every several years the possibility to integrate the results of the research project into existing standardization activities. And some other fields, we also developed some roadmaps and so on, was similar, which was mentioned in the Resistant project from Sasha already. There was the main focus was there not to develop standard, but to develop something like a standardization roadmap, so we know what kind of topics standardization should tackle in the next years. Well, I'm coming here from the Smart Metro Resilience project, which is one of the security and smart city related projects we have at Dean. So a bit about the background on the project. We have 3 different main topics. One is about climate change. The second one is about critical infrastructure dependency. That's the reason why we're also part of this panel here today. Thank you for the invitation, by the way. And also the last third point is the social issues or social aspects. And the most important thing is that we have a holistic approach on the resilience. So resilience, you cannot say only, oh, that's critical infrastructure resilience, it's climate change resilience. No, resilience, as we learned today, has a lot of definitions. And that means if it has a lot of definitions, then it can be applied in really different topics and ways. And security by itself, I know it from the terminology, was already defined more than 30 times in the standardization world. But of course, because security in water, drinking water is something different than security, for example, in transportation. So that's the reason why we also need these different terminologies. Well, one key aspect of the SMR project are the cities. The city are the key aspect because they are like a multiplier. They have the more or less the power to bring together the most important stakeholders, the critical infrastructure providers, to really work together. Because normally, how does it work? The providers have the power to maintain their work, but in the end, to collaborate with the other critical infrastructure, that's quite a difficult thing, because what is the benefit for them personally? The benefit is only for the city, because the city has to ensure security in the city. So then they have to think a bit more overarching. That's the reason why it's really important to have the city, like city stakeholders, city council in projects like the SMR project. And as mentioned before, SMR was the only standardization body which was part of this DR7 project. So we act as a focal point. So we supported standardization in this regard. What was our strategy for standardization within the project? First, we had to identify the standardization items or standardization relevant standardization activities for the project, which were based on the list of standard, but also like on a workshop we have conducted where we have invited all the different other projects on the topic, but also which other DRS projects which are related to the topic. For example, also the Smart Resilience project was attended, which was not a DR7 project. And of course, we also did a survey to more or less to identify what is the importance, what are the needs, what we want to have in the end. Then, of course, we have more or less an agglomeration having a need on one side, which is more or less the demand from a city, what kind of standards they need, what kind of actually, I would not call it standard, more like what kind of tools they need to foster the resilience in their cities. And standard will be then a tool to disseminate, to bring this need in a document. And on the other hand, we have the supply side, which are the tools on the different research projects, but also existing standards. Maybe there are already some standardization activities which are important, so we don't have to develop new ones. And one example, only a current one, there's a new working group, a new project on private security provision for critical infrastructure protection. And what we have done in the project afterwards, the result was, after this strategy, like that we develop a standard series called City Resilience Development, which is an overarching like series on different topics that the city should tackle when they want to foster their own resilience in the city. And the standard series, the most important one, is an overarching 17,300 standard workshop agreement. It's called City Resilience Development Operational Guidance. This operational guidance, there have been more than 17 cities on board on this project. So 17 European and a few outside of Europe participated in this development of standards. So you can already see that one of the crucial things is that not only the partners of the project are on board, standardization has the possibility to bring externals which are not part of the project into the revision of the results of a project, and which is quite important. We had in the project by itself, SMR, 7 cities on board, and so we brought a few others inside to really assess a bit what we have done and to bring it on another level, of course, because if more stakeholders would accept the procedure or the tools we are providing, then of course it will be more applicable afterwards for them. Then after this overarching document, which I will show in the next slide, what is it about, we have developed 2 other documents. One is a maturity model, and the other is an information portal. The maturity model is kind of a 5 stages process which a city should go through in order to become more resilient. It has 5 stages from starting stage until the vertebrate stage. What more information you can read also find on the internet pages and so on, which I can provide you the links afterwards. And the other one is the information portal, which is a quite of interesting tool because it's an engagement, a communication tool with the citizens actually, and also with all the stakeholders of the city. So a lot of websites are very existing where the interaction with cities are taking place, but the issue is that all are different. So we also try to harmonize this a bit and to bring some of the key aspects on how a page or information portal should look like. Coming back to the operational guidance, we have 5 steps there, which are the which will be like needed to bring to foster the standardization to foster the resilience development in a city. And the first one, of course, you need to assess where you are. That's a baseline review. Afterwards, you have to check which risk your city is facing, and not only in a single way. You also have to find it interdisciplinary, and have to see the interlinkages between the risk itself. So they have to also provide different tools, which you can see in the document afterwards. Afterwards, it's important to develop a resilience strategy, and then afterwards to conduct different activities and actions to implement the strategy. And in the end, you have to evaluate everything, and then the first cycle is over, and then you might, when you come back to maturity stages, you might bring your city from the maturity stage starting maybe to the next stage, but then you have to go the next iteration again, because, well, if you have done it once, it doesn't mean that you have done it perfectly in this way, so you have to revise all your activities again. But that's only an example. These 3 documents are currently under finalization and will be published most probably in the end of next month. Sorry. I'm talking a lot of SEN workshop agreement and so on, so maybe not all are aware of it, so I just put one figure there to explain the main features of this tool. Well, first of all, the most important thing is a formal initiation is there from the public, so everybody can ask for developing a SEN workshop agreement. Then there will have to be drafted a project plan, and this project plan will be publicly available 1 month on a website, so everybody can comment on it and can participate. That's one of the major benefits in standardization. So everybody who wants to participate can then participate also at the kickoff meeting and contribute with his experiences. Afterwards, there's a possibility when the kickoff meeting was done and the development is going through. When you have a first draft, you are also able to interact again with the public and to publish a draft document, which then also can be commented by the public. And in the end, you can see the SEN workshop agreement will be published and will be distributed among all standardization partners or standardization system, which is all over the world. And mainly, when I say it like between the timing, of course, when you need first 1 month to publish the project plan and so on, I had already some examples where the SEN workshop agreement only took 4 or 5 months, not more, and also some other examples where it took 12 months, for example, the city resilience development on this operational guidance, which I just have mentioned, because we have done it at the same time as developing the tool. So that's the reason why we had some advantages, but also some time constraints. So we only have developed this the whole document in 7 months. But it's a really extensive document, a document of 50 pages with a lot of interactions. But at the same time, of course, we have benefit from the activities in the project. So maybe to summarize a bit the standardization approach in SMR, first part is more like experience exchange. Is quite important. Or bring people together, stakeholders together, exchange of experience. And what was also quite important in our project was to understand the concept of resilience. In some countries, well, there have been Norman just said, oh, well, we don't know the term resilience, but now we are in a project and we will develop a resilience management guideline. Oh, how we should do it if you don't know the resilience term. So that's the reason we also quite of, I would say, like make the difficult things somehow easy and starting with a easy thing to just define resilience. But of course, you can define it in a broad way, and as it is done by now, having like 6 or 7 lines and 150 words to describe resilience, or you do it in a simple matter, and then you have to see, well, who is the target audience you want to talk to, and then often a definition which is too complex won't be understood. So that's the reason why we have to really to think also when interaction with the public. What is resilience actually for us? How we can define it or describe it in a simple way that everybody can understand it. Of course, unification of standardization potential was the last part of the last item of part 1. From part 2, then when we had the results, of course, we want to exploit them. That's the reason why we developed the standards, the standard series consisting of 3 different standards. And well, within this standards development, of course, we also established new communities and working groups, because not only the SMR project by itself was involved, also other projects and other stakeholders, which we have not thought about before, have shown the interest to participate. So that's the reason why it was a kind of new movement in this regard, and I think this is quite important. Besides this kind of event like Committee of Users from the European Commission to establish different communities where they can work to, and they also can exchange their thoughts and experiences. And the last and final is like point which I want to point out is the transferring of the results into national and international level. Now we are actually transferring 2 of the SAN workshop agreements into that will most probably be adapted to ISO level, because we have presented these documents in the last committee at a meeting, and they are really interested to adapt it. And at the same time, we already have been in touch with several other national standardization bodies to adapt the SAN workshop agreements already on national level. So not waiting until the project ends and let just the document be in a share folder somewhere. No, to be proactive. I think that's the main important thing we should do with regard to resilience, to be proactive, to spread our knowledge and experiences and also the tools and documents we have developed. Well, to summarize and to finalize my presentation, Dean, especially also me, have been taking part also in other research projects, security-related research projects. For example, the Driver Plus project is a big crisis management and disaster resilience project, where also will be an I4CM meeting in the 3rd and 4th of September in Warsaw. So if you're interested, please contact me, or maybe you've heard about already yesterday from Stephanie Albero from Arctic. If you're interested, just contact us and participate and become one of our community as well. Then I had 2 national ones in Ogesi. It's called innovative business models for the protection of critical infrastructures. There was one of the standards we have developed was terminology, but a terminology which were among all different what we say, like critical infrastructure, not providers, but fields. For example, the gas, the water, and the electricity field. They all have their own associations. They have their own terms in this regard. So we have tried to bring these together, because when an accident happens, or another shock or something like this, then of course they have to speak among themselves. And so when, for example, the water sector thinks that this damage or something like this is something different in their point of view, and the gas experts, then they are speaking different languages, and then we have an issue when they start talking to each other when the problem occurs. And the last one I want to present is a Kirman project, which is also a national one, where we also try to identify the minimum criteria for critical infrastructure protection. And the last but not least was already presented in the very beginning when you introduced myself, Sylvia. Thank you for that. It's a Bridget 2 project where we try to strengthen the relationship between the research innovation community and standardization. So we try to, with the support of the European Commission, to close a bit the gap, and to also to give the Research and Innovation Committee more information on what standardization actually is doing and also to identify a bit more what are the needs of the Research Innovation Committee. And so if you're more interested in this project, please come to me. I'm more than happy to give you more information on this. What we're doing as well there, which is quite interesting here, is we're doing a study on the importance or the integration of standardization in European research programs. So we will see what is the outcome of it. So we also will see there how standardization was addressed the last years in these projects. And I can already announce more or less next October will be the final European conference of this project, and we will also, of course, invite you all to participate. More information you can find on the website of Bridget too. Well, this was actually my presentation for now. On the last slide, I can only thank you. Well, I have also some conclusions in the end. I see, well, just to give a last summary, of course, it's really important to integrate standardization in research innovation projects because, well, we are trying to take up the results of the project into the market and to bring it available to everybody. Then we strengthen the resilience by sharing experiences among the most relevant stakeholders, and we provide practical tools and documents like the SEN Workshop Agreement series, which I just have presented. And finally, to uplift and to take advantage of the standardization system, which is big. All countries in the world are part of the system, so all can benefit from the documents which are developed in this system. And now, finally, I can say thank you. And the last slide is about the contact details of each of the secretaries and workshop leaders of the standards we have developed in the Smart Metro Resilience project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we have a little bit of a discussion between the panelists. So which one of you wants to break the ice and ask the first question? You have no questions. What about you, Sasha?
Yeah. Okay, so we did have some discussions up front, and we, of course, wanted to have, or at least to give an impression that, so to say, in this area everything is clean and clear and so on. But you see, the presentations, I think, which we got here, gave us maybe new material to ask new questions. So I would maybe just start with one question first to René, and then in addition to that one, maybe to George. The question would be that related to the relatively new thing which you, in a way, also addressed in my speech, the speed of standardization. It was obvious that at least DEAN, probably other national standardization bodies have provided the ways to speed up the whole process. What would be your, so to say, personal feeling? What is the trade-off? I mean, once when we speed up the process, we necessarily reduce the time for discussions, for taking on board different opinions of other stakeholders, maybe abroad, maybe in other stakeholders group, and so on. So there must be some trade-off. Could you comment and say how would you expect this trade-off to be, and if it's maybe negative, how to overcome that?
Thank you for the question. It's quite an interesting one, and no, but that's perfect. I have to say, of course, the standardization system is not a new one. DEAN became last year 100 years old, so standardization is not the newest like approach. And for this reason, of course, also the development of a standard like 3 years is not established in the last 10 years. But the last 10 years, we have had quite impressive improvements with regard to interaction between people. For example, web meetings and so on. This was not possible before. So of course, the process could be adapted a bit with regard to the means we have today. So that's the reason why we can benefit of having, well, before was it maybe more like this, that the printed standard or the draft standard have been sent to each country for revision, and this was taking some time, of course. But now you can just click in your email box and then it's sent, or you use a storage folder and in the internet, and then of course you can spread the information, you can receive information faster and easier than before. This, I think, was one of the aspects. And of course, the changing environment is incredible fast now. So when we want to say that one technology, which was like, for example, before, took maybe 2-3 years to be well established, now it takes 2-3 years to have a new technology. So that's the reason we have to react fast, and that's the reason why you need to bring in the state of the art now and not in 2 or 3 years, because then the state of the art won't be anymore the state of the art. Of course, this was seen and also addressed by standardization organizations, and that's the reason why we have shortened the time period to develop a standard. And I think we're in a really good way. We will improve further, and especially when looking to the research and innovation projects where we are involved. Of course, we are also quite of newcomers in this. We have at Dean we have been participating in several ones already the last years, but of course we are like developing ourselves as well. So the same as the researchers becoming more aware of standardization, we are as a standardizer, I would call it like this, becoming more aware on how research is ongoing, so how we can best benefit from each other. And for this reason, I really like also the Budget 2 project where I'm involved, where we try to identify a bit more what are the needs. And it would be great also to have now a smaller discussion, or at least to have some comments on what actually you would like to have from standardization. Because of course we can only offer what we know and what we are able to do. So, and also what so that is maybe after answering hopefully your question well, Sasha, to put a new question on the board.
If I can just add something, the idea of faster standards is actually very relevant at the moment. We are discussing that, and was actually the Commission a few years ago in a communication who said that development time should basically halve before 2020. But what we have found in our discussion and during this joint initiative on standardization, where we try to upgrade the system, is that we need timely standards. Standards don't necessarily have to be fast by cutting out on discussion time, consensus building, and all the other things that make a standard. But a standard needs to be there when it's needed. So that's actually the main problem, rather than speed.
I think that was the really right answer, because all what we do here is certainly done with some target group of stakeholders in mind. And if the researchers and the standardization bodies do not manage to meet so these requirements, which are coming in a precise and obviously timely way, we have to live with the fact that many of the results of our work will be out of date, and that's at the end waste of money and time. In that sense, if I will finish my, so to say, slot of questions, I would just like to see, to ask George if he would see new possibilities in that what JRC is doing in the last years, also in helping ensuring post-project life of our research projects, because we have been ending since a long time all these projects with thick documents saying that's going to be exploitation plan, this partner will take 13.5% of something which is never going to be sold, and so on and so on. But at the end, we would essentially need a living, a dynamic structure in which, if somebody wants to capitalize on the results of the proceeding, I see a lot of potential in that what JRC has built in the last years. And I think that many other people will also do so, but I would like to see and hear what is your opinion.
Thank you very much. It's funny, I had this question twice now over the course of 2 days.
It's my first day here.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, thank you very much for the question. I appreciate it. The JRC does two things. Part of it does primary research. So, for example, I'll talk in my second presentation about some of our colleagues who are working on building safety and are contributing actively to and have contributed actively to establishing the Euro codes and are contributing actively towards research. They have a big research facility in our main campus in Ispra. However, the second thing that JRC is doing is what Philippe called in his presentation yesterday, his introductory presentation yesterday, as a mediator. So a lot of our work is uptaking research or primary research done by other researchers, colleagues, and somehow translating, for lack of a better word, these outcomes into policy input. So yeah, our role in that sense is one of a mediator. To that extent, yes, we are using deliverables and outcomes of European projects. However, at least the way I see it, that's only my personal opinion, we don't do it systematically. That is, when we have a topic to address, when we're given a topic to address by our colleagues in policy DGs, we tend to look at the literature, we tend to look at what's done, we tend to look at whatever we have available and try to come up with a solution, right? That may or may not include the work that has been done by European projects. In a lot of our work, we use them, and I have personally used the outcomes of some very interesting projects in several aspects of my work. However, that happened because I looked for it. So I did not know of the project. I did not know what the outcomes of the project were. One option that I could come up with, and this is, again, strictly my personal opinion after a year and a half at the JRC, would be to somehow link the JRC with relevant projects. So one option would be for the project coordinator to look at the unit, person, team, whatever it is, at the JRC who's addressing that topic, and doing something as simple as forwarding them the deliverables, forwarding them a link of the project. At least from my perspective, that would make our lives a lot easier, and it would definitely make the uptake of projects a lot better. It would improve the uptake of the project outputs. I'm sorry. Another topic to point out here, which is somehow relevant, is the interoperability between the different tools. So I've seen it before in crisis management. My background is in emergency management, so I was in contact with several of these projects, and I was aware of what was going on. We've seen it in crisis management and disaster risk management. There have been a lot of projects which have produced very interesting results, very important capabilities. But each of them addresses a part of the picture. Maybe different parts of the picture. Each one addresses a different part of the picture. If we brought all of those together,
then we could address a bigger part of the picture. However, more often than not, that's not possible because those tools are not compatible to each other, cannot talk to each other. So how to address that, I don't know, because one could say that calls could maybe impose constraints on how the tools would be built. I beg to differ. That would constrain the creativity that we need of researchers. So that's something we should not do. I don't have a solution. I wish I had. Maybe if I stay another year and a half at JRC, I may come up with a solution. No, I probably won't. I'm not that wise. Anyway, so I think it's just a partial answer there. If I had to give a takeaway, that would be that both sides need to be more active. I'm positive that as soon as a JRC staffer or researcher knew of a project, of an ongoing research project, they would definitely follow it and they would definitely care about what's going on. After all, we're all researchers, so we're somewhat passionate with what we're doing. That's it.
Yeah.
Oh. Just not to lose the thread. There is something which I think is worth be mentioned today at this meeting, because it shows the link between industrial-related standardization and the research, organized as a bottom-up stuff. Philip is not here to accuse me for my Anglo-Saxon whatever background, but it is the, and I think you are also aware, René, it's International Industrial Consortium, Internet Consortium, which is essentially dealing with developing the products in different places worldwide. Huawei, Bosch, IBM are all doing this. That could be something which at least should be looked at as a sort of a possible model for what we are doing here. And I'm not saying that it is the solution, but it is something which allows different people to work together and solve at least one part of your interoperability problem, which I think is the problem of the future. Something where we need upfront standards.
Thank you. Maybe I totally agree with you. I think maybe also what in fast and easier approaches, which is already done in the last months, I would say. For example, in DR7 projects, we have developed a white paper, as Yvonne mentioned today in the morning. This white paper was concluding more or less the outcomes of the 5 under the same topic funded projects, and I think this is one of the main issues we have, that we, of course, it's important to fund different researchers and we do different projects in different topics, if it's critical infrastructure protection or other security or resilience-related topics. But we have to bring the topics in the end together, and this should be done within the last. We're doing the project, the duration for sure, but at least in the end of the project, so that not only the European Commission, when reviewing the whole projects, but also like the public and the user of maybe of the different project outcomes, outputs, what you said, like that you are searching for it, but maybe it would be better if you get it in an easier form to you, and then you have the possibility to check easier which project has done which activities. Then you can step in the project and see, okay, this project has done this activities, then I have to check more this or the other project. And of course, then standardization could be one element to support this activity. As mentioned before, we have done this as a focal point for standardization in DR7. We have tried to bring the stakeholders together because that's our business, what we're doing all the time. So for this reason, of course, standardization won't be part of all research innovation projects, but at least it would be good to be part or in the major calls and try to be a bit more overarching. Like in the end, this operational guidance document which we have developed, the SEN virtual document 17300, is an overarching document which is explaining the 5 tools we have developed in the project. So that's actually the integration of our own project of the tools. So of course we had also the issue that we have 5 different tools and how best use them. And that was an issue we have solved via this guideline or this operational guidance we have developed. So I think this kind of was I would call it a white paper on a research project basis, but the white paper would then be the solution for having projects under the same call funded, so like different projects. But within a project, at least something like a guideline or the different tools within a project can be developed or should be developed as well, in which, of course, the most important thing is the integration of the tools and the benefit of the tools for the user in the end, because that's one of the aspects as well which I'm like to be part of the standardization system, is the clearness and the content of the standard, because you're sure what is it about, that's meaning of the scope, and who is the target group. I think that's kind of specific, and this was a bit revised as well when we developed the standards. It was like, okay, what is actually the target group of our tools? So that's a question which was raised, of course, in the project. But when you have externals on board, then they ask the questions differently. And this is something which is really, really important after having worked, for example, 2 years in a research project only in your own cells, I would call it, or in your own rooms or houses. But then going out with your results and let the others talk as well, and then to produce a common document or approach which then can be easier accepted also from the outside.
Okay, shall we open the debate then to the public as well? Are there any questions for our panelists? Someone is still awake?
Yes.
For these very interesting presentations. I would like to know different things when you mentioned CWAs and standardization outcomes that you have already produced. Do you use terms of reference referring to existing standard, international standard, the basic one, the one that were mentioned, like the 31,000 series, 223,000, and all these very, very strong structuring market standards that are used? Are they part of what you produce? Do you mention them? And also, do you consider working with the people managing security and safety within critical infrastructures? Because at the end, everything you are producing is very useful to them, but they will be the ones operating it. So do you work with them, these people who are responsible for this, who are the one in charge of looking at the whole pattern, who are making the investments, who will be held responsible in front of justice or by the public in case there is any problem? How do you interact with them?
So I guess the question is directed directly to me. And I will answer the second part first. The biggest benefit we had in our project, SMR project, was the involvement of the 7 cities. In the 7 cities, there was not one person involved. In the cities, there have been the whole department involved. And usually we had also the crisis manager of the city on board, so within the project. So that he has the contacts to all the critical infrastructure providers of the city, and that's the reason why I was highlighting this in my presentation as well, that I find it kind of crucial to include something like a multiplier or like tunneling system. I would call it tunneling system maybe, because the city by itself, of course, don't provide the security, but they have to ensure it. they have to say, at least when, well, in the end they are responsible for it. And if the critical infrastructure provider, sorry, is not doing its work, then the city has to say, no, we have to replace it, we have to do it differently, because they are in charge of it. So the crisis manager is one of the main persons we have on board from the different projects. And what was the question, the first part again? Was it about?
Are you?
Yeah, to reference, yes. Yes, that is a good question. Reference to existing standards is correct. That's the reason why we had the strategy. We were looking to the standards which are existing, and of course then have decided which is the gap and what kind of standards we need to fill this gap. We have, of course, put references within the standards to existing standards, because in the end, standalone standards won't be successful. We have to integrate them one to each other, and that's the reason why, of course, we also look to different standards on different levels, not only on ISO level but also on national level. So we have also checked the national standardization documents in Europe and beyond. Yeah. Thank you.
ERNSA is about pre-standardization instead of standardization itself. However, a lot of the experts that make up the thematic groups are critical infrastructure operators. They are working for companies that provide security products, which are then consumed by critical infrastructure operators. So there is that connection does exist. Whenever it is needed, it is felt that better connection is needed, then we do something about it. I would like to point out two examples. One of them was ICCF, the Industrial Automation Control System Certification Framework, Compliance and Certification Framework, where the thematic group did a broad consultation of critical infrastructure operators inter alia to investigate the feasibility of the framework. And the second one was a thematic network that we were operating with DG Enner, if memory serves, a few years ago, on the critical energy infrastructure protection. And that network brought together a couple of hundred representatives of critical energy infrastructure operators out of memory, right? So that type of network does exist, and then we definitely evaluate a lot in our activities.
Just one small comment.
Yep.
So small comment to your question, very targeted. Every CWA has a chapter which is called normative reference, in which all of them are listed. Then it has a reference to the technical work, which is at the end of the document. So we do it. The second part, European Commission insists on involvement of end users. We have projects. I'm not going to talk about SMR with all the cities, but for instance, in the project which I was referring to, the Smart Resilience, we have water from Sweden, energy from Finland, transportation from Hungary, and so on. So altogether, 11 infrastructures, all different, involved in the process, with their end users and everything what so to say, follows the whole process. The problem which we have identified so far, again, one of my heretic statements, is that when you talk to the end users, in the infrastructures, for instance, but it can be maybe in the other case, they have their own list in which all the problems can be grouped in two areas. One is compliance, one is the new thing. And if you ask them what comes first, I don't have to tell you what comes in the daily operation on the first place. So we have to find a way to promote the importance of the new solutions. And this is only through the standardization of type 2, which I have mentioned, to promote and say, yes, you, the operator, your responsibility does not end up with the compliance. That the operation was okay, but the patient died, will not save you. So we have to do things and to change the mindset in many situations, which will go then in this direction of including research aspects, possibly standardized, into the daily work of the operators. That was a long comment which I wanted to make short.
No problem. Thank you very much. Any other question? Yes. I think the mic is up here.
Yes, I would say that CWA are very good in order to fix some of the main results of research, but what is important to understand is that generally the standards offer solutions to real difficulties in the field. So it is very important to have the right stakeholders in the driving seat. So possibly after CWA, so the transformation into a real standard. And so it is very important to make the right kind of publicity in order to push all the real stakeholders who are the people and the institutions facing the difficulties to participate in the transformation of the CWA into a real standard. So it is important to push these people to participate and then come to a formal standard which will be used in practice and which will be very useful to minimize a difficulty or to solve entirely a difficulty. This was the things I wanted to highlight. But maybe you have some further thoughts to express further to my comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this statement. Well, a sandbox agreement is true. It's more or less not limited, but of course only a part of the interested parties is participating in developing this document. But on the other hand, we are trying to bridge a bit this gap and to make, for example, this so-called liaison to technical committees already in the very beginning of developing a standard like a sandbox agreement, so that already maybe the next level, like the European standard, is already aware of what we are doing, and then the standardization committees on European level, international level, they have the all interested parties in their working groups. So then they can already give their, well, they are not maybe experience as well if they also want to contribute, because it's public to participate. But of course, then we try already to bridge this gap and to give a bit some support to make the transfer as easy as possible and also as fast as possible. That's the reason why we have, for example, now we are trying to bring 2 of the 3 sandbox agreements directly on ISO level within this year, more or less, so which would be a quite successful story, because it's, if you imagine that you developed 3 years in a project and then you bring the results of the project into international level within half a year, that's kind of successful, I would call it like this. So there are ways on how to do it. Of course, there will be coming more ways in the next years, and we have to see to the future what possibilities is giving to us. The standardization on one part, but also the research innovation, the transferring of their results into the market. Maybe there are also some other tools. Standardization is one of the tools, which is, I think it's a quite important one. But also, like, we all have to think in the end that the money we spend in research innovation should go to the market. We should bring it to the market. We should benefit all from it, especially when we're talking about security and resilience. Well, we cannot wait 20 or 30 years until the tools will be implemented and will be helpful for us. No, we need it now. That's the reason why I guess also the European Commission is supporting in the next framework program also security in a higher level. For this reason, yeah, we have to find the tools and instrument to implement the results on the market. That's standardization, one of the tools. Yeah.
I fully agree with that. Also, I would like to highlight that the main scope of standardization is actually to facilitate interoperability. So also all the discussion we had before is basically highlights the fact that standardization is an open process, is transparent, is non-discriminatory, everyone can participate, and the final aim of it is to ensure interoperability between processes and services and products and everything. Any other question?
Actually, it's not a question. It's a comment about security-related standardization. You have to realize, obviously, that there are a lot of components which are classified of confidential nature, and CEN cannot deal with classified information. So there is certainly a reflection to be done when I have heard at DG Home, for example, that there are needs for certification of detection equipment for CBRN substances. And they say, well, it does not exist. We are obliged to provide member states with recommendations of equipment which are coming from China or US, which are certified. Because in Europe, we cannot deal with standards with classified components. So there is certainly, and I do not have the solution, I have some ideas about this, but I would encourage interactions with standardization experts regarding these aspects, because we know that we can have a core publicly available standard being developed, which is okay, but then the work which is related to classify components is not CEN-TC that can tackle this. It's member states with, I would say, habilitation to do that. So it's not anymore a standard, it's a matter of council decision of classified nature, which is very tricky, and we are not yet at this point. So security-related standardization, I hear a lot of this today, which is very interesting. It is not as simple as you can present it.
Okay, any other questions or comments? And I fully agree with you. Indeed, the security is the next big thing to come up, because it's probably not even a standard. It will be called something different. It's a different animal.
Maybe that's what you said before. Standardization is about transparency. So and we have to find solutions on how to tackle what you just said, Philippe. Yeah.
Do we go ahead with the next presentation? Okay. Then I think it's your turn.
Yep.
But I think you can free, yeah, you are free for leaving the panel, because there are only 2 presentations more, yeah. Thank you to you, thank you very much.
I just noticed the sign on the podium. It says, this is a remote. There's an arrow which says next slide and another arrow which says previous slide. All right. Yeah, there's a paper here that says, actually, this is the remote. Yeah. Anyway. All right. Well, thank you for bearing with us, ladies and gentlemen. Now it's my turn to discuss as briefly as possible the Joint Research Center's, the JRC's multidisciplinary approach to urban SIP. By now, probably all of you know what the JRC is, so I'll skip this one. As I mentioned before, the JRC's activities span across a wide variety of scientific disciplines. Therefore, one could identify a wide range of its activities that are or can be directly related to urban critical infrastructure protection. However, in this presentation, I would like to discuss 3 of our activities which are somehow institutionally directed to the Commission's critical infrastructure protection activities. Specifically, I would like to focus on ERDSIP. I left that on a bit of a cliffhanger in my previous presentation.
the impact of natural hazards on technological systems, and building safety. I will start with ERNSIP. I showed this slide previously. So ERNSIP is a facilitated network of security-related experts who essentially volunteer their time with a pre-standardization of security products focus. The main deliverables nowadays from ERNSIP include recommendations for standardization, research, and in support of EU policy, but also in terms of guidance to infrastructure operators regarding protective security. Another deliverable is the ERNSIP inventory, which started as an online database of facilities which can support pre-standardization or have had a security product focus. The ERNSIP inventory was the original outcome of ERNSIP, as its name suggests, European Reference Network. Nowadays, we have 135 experimental facilities from 24 member states registered in ERNSIP. Needless to say, we're looking to expand that database, so if there are facilities which have such an interest, I would like to invite you to start by finding out more in the ERNSIP website, at the JRC's website. The second part of ERNSIP's work includes the thematic groups, which are, as we have already discussed, groups of experts, most of whom volunteer their time to develop guidance and or policy support documentation. The thematic groups are commissioned and or financially supported by policy-oriented directorates general of the European Commission, specifically at this point DG Home and DG Connect. And it is through that process that the European Commission is directing the focus of thematic groups. This is the list of, as I said before, this is the list of thematic groups that have recently completed their work or are currently active. 7 of them are currently working, but in total we have included 450, actually more than 450 experts from more than 200 organizations and 18 member states in ERNSIP thematic groups. Additional connection with critical infrastructure protection in the member states comes from the ERNSIP expert group, which is a working group made up of critical infrastructure protection representatives of each member state. Each member state should ideally have 1 representative, so we should have 24 member states. If memory serves, I think we only have 18 by now. This is a list of thematic groups. You can see and their sponsors. You see that we have thematic groups working on chemical and biological hazards and threats related to weapons and explosives, radiological and nuclear threats, but also physical security and cybersecurity, as I presented in the previous slide, in the previous presentation. I'm sorry. Another part of our work involves the impact of natural hazards on critical infrastructure. This part of our work really spans across 2 policy areas, namely civil protection and critical infrastructure protection. Civil protection to the extent that it addresses natural disasters, and critical infrastructure protection to the extent that this policy area is all hazards in nature.
So last year we did a study, a forensic study, where we analyzed the impact of several natural hazards on the power grid being recognized as probably the ubiquitous critical infrastructure in Europe and a pillar of modern economies. So we looked at the earthquake damage, but also flood and a bit more exotically space weather damage. We tried to identify the types and causes of damage, which components of the power grid are most vulnerable, what drives recovery, and some idea of recovery time. However, this work obviously needs to be refined. It is by no way do we consider it a complete inventory. We also looked at several aspects of the progressive recovery of the power grid to what and its relationship to resilience. We confirmed a few obvious findings, such as that appropriate network configurations tend to increase resiliency and that they increase robustness. We saw that network interconnections seem to be more resilient than radial networks. But we also identified a few relatively counterintuitive aspects, one of which was that the capability to meet response-generated demands seems to be critical to power grid, to the resiliency of the power grid. Another part of our work focused on several climate change scenarios and how those would affect the risk from floods to critical infrastructure. Again, we focused on the power grid, and well, the obvious outcome here is that as climate change increases the frequency and severity of floods, needless to say, the level of risk from floods will increase. However, there were a couple of findings that somehow surprised us. The top slide shows which part of a major urban area in Europe, which we dubbed Hazardville to anonymize, would be affected by flood. The bottom map shows which part of that same area would be affected by the power outage caused by that flood. So you see that the area is, well, more or less twice, or even a bit more. If you consider that the power outage lasts longer than the flood itself, then that points to something. The other part, the other conclusions that somehow caught us by surprise was that, or that we found interesting at least, was that the biggest part of the recovery cost is borne by substation repairs. So if you somehow protect your substations, you've done a lot. You've gone a long way into protecting your power grid. Another relevant part of our work is related to the impact of natural hazards on industrial facilities. The problem here is that when we talk about the Seveso accidents, both the safety reports and emergency operation plans tend to assume, silently or not, that there will be just one incident. However, in the aftermath of an earthquake, there is bound to be 4 or 5 at the same time, which means that there will be a critical resource shortage and there will be a need to prioritize. With that in mind, my colleagues have developed RAPID-N, or what they call the Rapid NATEC Risk Assessment and Mapping System. I talked about that briefly yesterday. It's an integrated natural hazard impact and consequence assessment tool. It is available online, free to use. You can find out more at this link. Last but not least, My colleagues at the ELSA laboratory are working to improve building safety to the extent that that can also affect the security of critical infrastructure. They have taken data from the Eurostat's census hub, and they have reviewed how many dwellings, how many residences are located in low, medium, and high seismic vulnerability classes, and have compared that with peak ground accelerations, that is the acceleration of the ground, the design of the design value of the acceleration of the ground in case of an earthquake. And they have realized that the majority of buildings in Europe are reaching or have exceeded their service life. And if you compare the peak ground, the design PGA or peak ground acceleration maps, a map of Europe on the left of the slide, with a map of the population density or building density in Europe, you see that in the seismic prone regions, which are marked in yellow or orange here, the majority of buildings were designed either without provisions for earthquake resistance or using outdated seismic codes, which points to the degree of vulnerability of the existing building stock in Europe to earthquakes. With that in mind, my colleagues are also contributing heavily to the update now the Eurocodes, which are the European building standards. It would be interesting to point out that the JRC was originally a big player in the development of the Eurocodes, which my civil engineering side now tells me that are a major component of civil engineering throughout Europe. With that, I have finished this part of this presentation. Thank you again for bearing with me, and if there are any questions, I'll gladly take them.
Thank you very much, Georgios. I think that, well, we will first invite Maciej to present his speech, and then we will have a question answer after that. Maciej, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Maciej Kuczyński. I am the Critical Infrastructure Protection Desk Officer in DG Home. And I will now, after this scientific and detailed presentation of Georgios, I'll try to go a little bit back to the generalities of the European Programme of Critical Infrastructure Protection, and especially the last developments in it. Now, before entering into the topic, I must precise that there is no a particular plan of urban critical infrastructure protection. So what I'm going to talk about is the general critical infrastructure protection program. Oops. Did I? All right, so couple of words about the background of the program. Critical infrastructure protection for a very long time was strictly in the competence of member states. The competences of European institutions in this field were virtually not existent, but was part of the national sovereignty. Things started to change slowly after the great trauma of September 11, 2001, quite obviously. However, it took a little bit more than that to finally push the member states to give the mandate to the Commission to enter this area, which until now was safely preserved from Brussels intervention. So other than the tragedy of 2011, there were other incidents, which 2004 Madrid tragedy, which I believe it was 14 years ago, but we still remember quite well. And also followed by the London attacks, and then the appearance of cyber threats such as the Stuxnet virus, and then later natural hazards reminded us that although Europe is maybe not exactly associated with the great natural disasters, our critical infrastructures can suffer from them too. It was the case of the volcanic ashes crisis, which took everybody by surprise and paralyzed the air transport in large parts of Europe. So that finally produced the first step. The European Commission was asked to design a program for critical infrastructure protection, which started to be elaborated in 2006 and it was the program had to be composed of many parts. The key of them was the directive on European critical infrastructures. Now, the negotiation of this directive was a difficult one. Member States initially asked the Commission to design a text on it, but in the phase of negotiations, this project seemed to be for them too ambitious. Therefore, it was seriously limited during the negotiation, and in order to be accepted, it had to be cut down in at least two ways. First, it was limited, and it is still limited, only to energy and transport. No other critical infrastructures are concerned by the directive. And the other one was that only the critical infrastructures which affect at least 2 member states are concerned, and the member states accepted only a limited mandate a limited intrusion of the Commission in this field. The directive precises that member states should identify and register with us such critical infrastructures after an agreement between all concerned member states. However, we are not even informed what those infrastructures are. We have no right to know it. We just know the number of such infrastructures per sector. The directive, once it was of course transposed in the national laws, didn't seem to raise a particular enthusiasm of national administrations. As the result, 10 years into its application, we still have only 89 European critical infrastructures identified and registered, 87 of them in the sector of energy and only 2 in the sector of transport. So from the beginning, it was clear that this directive is not exactly working very well. Therefore, when the time of the first review came, in 2012, it was decided that the EPSI must try a new approach of the issue. Thank you. The new approach consists on the fact that we do not really insist now that the states identify and register those infrastructures. We rather insist that the states try to maintain the permanence of critical services produced by critical infrastructures. The accent is no more put on the registration and identification and registration, but on the increase of resilience of the whole of infrastructures which produce critical services. And in 2012, it was asked of the member states launch and finance study projects of resilience of 4 most critical infrastructures, which were the Eurocontrol, the Galileo, the gas and electricity grid. So we are at that was the last development in the directive. However, the EPSIP had also some other elements. I'm sorry, I have to backtrack. This system is not particularly practical. So what were the other elements other than the directive? There was an idea that there should be an information and warning network via which specialists and administrations and scientists could exchange information about critical infrastructure protection. So that was the creation of the CWIN network, Critical Infrastructure Warning and Information Network, which is operational, but ultimately, once again, because of reservations of member states, the warning element was cut down. It doesn't operate. Nobody wanted actually to become operational. The information part exists. This is mostly a safe repository of documents in which, well, as I said, scientists, administrations, and other experts can share safely documentation, only non-classified one, where nothing classified can be contained in CWIN. Other than that, we have actually about 15,000 documents in it, and it has its use. There was then the program of the CIPS program. The Commission devoted some 140 million euros to a total of 125 research projects in critical infrastructure protection. That program is now over. It ran until 2013. The last deliverables were arrived somewhere in 2016, and it is now officially closed. So the projects were in three fields. Some of them were purely theoretical research. Others were the development of software. Some were also served to develop hardware, like, for example, new prototypes of robots for bomb disposal or for research of dangerous, of hazardous substances. So this project produced some actual real results. The next element of the program was the external dimension of the EPSIP. It was, well, the terrorism and the dangers to critical infrastructures are issues which are global. They go way beyond the European Union. Therefore, we started a collaboration, mostly an exchange of experiences and best practices, first with Canada and United States, which was followed by the development of cooperation with neighboring states from Eastern Europe and Western Balkans, and most recently Georgia. So the 9 most neighboring countries, and both those collaborations produced interesting results. When you go beyond the ocean and you talk with Americans and Canadians, well, you can immediately see that although they face the same dangers, they have a completely different approach to them. We learned a lot from it. Without entering into too much details, we were, for example, surprised how much Americans and Canadians rely on the voluntary cooperation of the private sector. They do not exactly approach the thing as we, with the recommendations, directives, and all other official texts. They insist a lot on the voluntary cooperation by private sector, in reasoning that if they produce, for example, better standards or better practices and put them freely at the disposition of the private sector, if then there is a disaster hitting in the private sector and they didn't react, they had at their disposition tools which they didn't use, they could face liability in tribunals. And then also, Americans told us that one of their greatest allies in the effort in critical infrastructure protection, and that is an interesting thing to think of, are the insurance companies. which are very much interested in distributing in the largest possible way any kind of improved security, safety, resilience standard in their industries. On the other hand, the one thing on which the Americans admitted that they are a little bit behind us is the study of hybrid threats. I will go to the hybrid threats in a moment, but they still approach the various components of hybrid threats separately. They do not really have the same, they are not yet as advanced in the reflection on the hybrid threats as a global thing as we are. With the neighboring countries, so mostly our eastern neighbors, we were even more surprised. For example, we realized during our first exchanges that they know a lot about our own work on critical infrastructure protection to such extent that some of them already transposed the directive on the directive of 2008 in their own legislation. We, of course, on the other hand, knew very little of them. Another thing that we realized during the first contacts was that they have an enormous experience in critical infrastructure protection. In fact, they have much more experience in that field than we have. Because Europe, fortunately, for the moment, experienced a relatively little number of serious, dangerous attacks against our critical infrastructures. Those 9 countries, on the other hand, experienced a very large number of them, including some of the most destructive nature. Therefore, the projects that we would like to develop with them, that is for the moment the idea that we are studying, is to mine this experience into a kind of a manual of reaction based on such experience like, hybrid warfare in Ukraine or open warfare that faced Georgia, Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, etc. So the EPSIP produced some concrete results, but it is clear that it could be improved. The effort of the 2012 pilot projects was one of such steps. Oh, and of course, I'm sorry, I forgot the very important component, that was the ERNSIP, which George has already mentioned. That is an extremely useful tool and a quite powerful tool with the working groups producing extremely interesting results. I personally was extremely impressed by the efforts on the virtual fencing for protection of CIPs and the protection against the CBRN threats, etc., etc. So what are the next steps? It was realized finally in 2016 and 17 that the directive as it is very unsatisfactory. We have to progress. The development of threats makes it obligatory. What were those factors which pushed us to reflect on the replacement, of the possible replacement of the directive? I will try to skip now. The slides will be, of course, made available to all participants. So there were. So we realized that there is very little about the cyber threats, and cyber threats were mostly addressed now by the NIS directive, but as you can see, we had to take into account the use of malware such as Hevex and Black Energy in 2014 and in 2015. So, and that was covered by the NIS directive, which ensures that member states are required to create a computer security incident response team, single contact points, and cooperate among them by setting a cooperation group. An even more dangerous alarm came when we realized the full potency of insider threats for critical infrastructures. Now, fortunately, once again, in Europe, there were for the moment only very limited alarms in this field. There was one incident in one French chemical plant, but which fortunately didn't produce a chemical attack, but caused one person dead. And there were suspicions that some recent alerts in Belgian nuclear plants could have been caused by an infiltrated agent, but there was no dangerous release, and the incident was ultimately minor. However, it is not the same thing in some other countries. The greatest tragedy caused by an insider took place in Egypt on 31st October 2015. When an infiltrated agent in the security of the airport planted a bomb on board of a Russian liner, and as a result, everybody on board, passengers and crew, were killed. There were in total 224 victims. The potency of the insider threats is particularly high in the cybersecurity. For example, our American partners found that more than half of all the cyber attacks are the work of insiders, although they are not all necessarily intentional. Some people can actually be duped into introducing dangerous malware in the networks, for example, by receiving gifts from and using them without thinking much of it in their work. By gifts, I mean, for example, the free USB sticks or free games, free commercials, etc. Now, the hybrid threats. That one was probably, that was a big wake-up call. 2014, 2015, use of the hybrid warfare in Ukraine, which repeatedly harmed the critical infrastructures of this country. So the hybrid warfare is, well, there are many definitions of it, but one that is most commonly used is a mixture of various conventional and unconventional attacks by an agent, state or non-state agent, used in a clandestine way in order to destabilize a country. So in the case of Ukraine, there was a mixture of conventional attacks, physical attacks, against the installations, of cyber attacks, and especially of massive propaganda. Propaganda attacks following every kind of incident of interruption of service, trying to present Ukraine as a failed state which is unable to protect and to serve its own citizens. In the Ukraine, with our Ukrainian partners, the thing that we learned, which was among the most important, is that transport and energy, which seemed to be so obvious nevralgic points in critical infrastructures, are not necessarily the most important. According to their analysis of the situation, the most crippling attacks that they suffered since 2014 were the attacks against their financial system. There were many instances in which for many days, sometimes for weeks, people could not operate, could not withdraw cash or not make any operations on their bank accounts. And that, if that lasts, can take to the economy to stop. And they were quite defenseless against it. So that is another new emerging threat against which we must think. Drones. Well, drones are drones in themselves are not exactly a threat. It is the illegal use of the drones that is the threat. Drones are actually a highly useful technology, including useful in protection of critical infrastructures, because they allow, for example, for an improved air survey of communication lines, of major industrial objects, or of mass public events, or especially, they have also a potential to intercept other drones. So the law enforcement can use them quite efficiently to eliminate the threat of illegal use of drones. So here, the wake-up call were the overflights of drones over French nuclear plants, which were not a hostile act. In fact, it is nowadays mostly analyzed as a kind of pranks. However, that was a signal that there is a potential also here for causing real damage. A much more important signal came from Iraq and Syria during the fight against Islamic State. ISIS used their own drones in an extremely efficient way, surprisingly efficient, using them for the battlefield survey, and also to launch real bombing attacks or intercept allied drones by ramming them. That showed that in a very short space of time, a relatively fresh entity could develop a fleet of dangerous new war technology. And they actually, very recently, it was in January 2018, Islamic State used this time combat drones in a large number, in a real formation of 24 of them against a Russian air base, and they managed to inflict some real damage on a regular military installation of a superpower. So that shows the potential of this of illegal use of drones in also sadly possibly in Europe. So all this, the directive being weak, poorly applied, and outdated, we had to think about some options for the future. There were some options were identified already in 2012. We thought that we could maybe insist on a better application of its mechanism, that the states actually really get into the identification of ECIs with all the consequences, that is, because once they are identified, for each of one, there is a need for to design a comprehensive security plan and to have designed a security officer who is the unique point of contact for all questions of security. We thought that it is maybe the simplest thing to repeal the directive and rely on the unilateral action of member states, which already do a great lot on the protection of critical infrastructures, both nationals and European ones. However, that means that this effort is not coordinated, so there can be a waste of resources. We thought about the possibility of maintaining the directive, but add accompanying voluntary measures. That for a long time was a favorite option. Repeal the directive and replace it with voluntary measures. Replace the directive with a new legislative instrument, which promises to be quite an exercise. That will be a long negotiation. And finally, have a new directive replacing the directive and add extra voluntary measures, which is the most ambitious thing. So all those options are on the table, but in order to try to find some maybe even some more options, we launched the evaluation of the directive. So it is now we are at the stage of call of interest to the evaluators to make the evaluation. So we hope that it should be once the call is answered, we should launch the evaluation itself in July, and it will be accompanied also by a consultation opened to the general public, which will last 12 weeks. We would really welcome any kind of feedback to prepare the future options. We would like the evaluator to see all particularly how should the complexity of the procedures of designation be reduced, because the member states informed us that the actual directive, by imposing a heavy administrative burden, probably discouraged from full application of its dispositions. Another part of the evaluation should be how to shift the focus from the identification to the protection, how to increase the attention to the resilience, and that is possibly the most crucial point, because in our consultations, which we already had with the operators informed us that the resilience, in fact, if you each time you increase the resilience, you also discourage the hostile agents of attacking. Because if the resilience guarantees you that the attack will cause virtually no disturbance in the critical service, they lose the capital they invested in this attack, including the operatives, the human operatives, virtually for nothing. And each such attack, rather than increasing the morale and bringing them new recruits, well, actually discourages from next efforts. Following the next point follows this one, that the priority should be given to maintain the essential services and not exactly the protection of infrastructure itself. Okay, I kept it relatively short to leave some time for questions, and also to, well, spare a little bit the audience, because I can feel that very fatigue is setting in. So I will be delighted to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maciej. Well, we open then the floor to both Maciej's presentation and Giorgos. Any reaction? Yeah.
Sorry, it's me again. I just wanted to know if you were aware that there's a standard about to be published by ISO TC 292. It's ISO 22326, called Managing Facilities with Identified Hazards. And it should cover most of what you mentioned during your presentation. It's an ISO standard, but it's Russian origin and a project team from Russia. Originally, it's based on their experience of protecting infrastructure, producing energy and also pipelines and gas. And it's managed by Germany. And lots of European countries were involved in this process. It's ISO 292, Working Group 3, Emergency Management. And if you need any information about this standard, ask Dean, because they have the secret of this TC. And it probably, if it's not in your references, it probably will bring you some ideas and help you in order to fulfill your task.
Thank you, Patricia. More comments? I have maybe one comment on ERTSIMP, because I'm dealing with 4 of the technical groups that you have presented. I think ERTSIMP should deliver more than recommendations. If you are dealing with pre-normative research, I have been a little bit teasing your colleagues in a soft manner, but firm manner, to not deliver only recommendations, but send workshop agreements. Because if you are working 4 years on pre-normative research, you should be driving your work to send workshop agreement, knowing that they are indeed working on a voluntary basis, which is more difficult actually for the group. Yet, but you have the DRS3 topic, you know, in standardization, which is open for 2 to 3 years. Next year, I would encourage you to tell your colleagues from ERTSIP that they have to apply and use their expertise gained to have good proposals. We expect that, because then there will be more resources available. More question? Message, maybe I'm relatively surprised that because here you speak about identification of critical infrastructure related to the directive, but there is no attempt to have a stronger, I would say, risk management or identification of protection measures that could be not imposed, but in a way based on regulatory instruments towards the member states. Are they resistant to that? Are they not willing to have any kind of recommendations related to specific measures to protect or prevent risk?
Well, to say, good question. The evaluation is for the moment at a very early stage. So we received the feedback for the moment mostly from the member states. As I said, they want less complex procedures of identification. They want less focus on identification and more on actual protection. They want more reflection on resilience rather than on the protection of individual infrastructures. And as well, for your question, I believe that it was actually mentioned in my presentation. There was, in fact, rather than the resistance, there was actually a request that we actually start to think on the protection rather than on identification. As for the concrete measures, now that we are not yet there, that will be, because the evaluation we hope will finalize in 2018, then we will have a possible impact assessment next year, and this is at that moment, but with the real options identified and being evaluated, then we will have time for, the member states will probably have more to say about it.
And how does it connect to the Seveso directive? Because in the Seveso directive, it's much more prescriptive with respect to, I would say, evaluation of risk and classification.
Well, we did not particularly look at that one because well, this new instrument, and like the previous one, which was really focused on all hazards, this new instrument should be really rather focused on human-caused hazards rather than the natural ones. So that will probably be a switch. Rather, the previous one was natural and human-caused. In the next one, we will go in a more specialized one. So we did not really, we looked quite a lot at the NIS directive for the possible future inspirations, but I must admit that we didn't particularly look at Seveso.
Okay, thank you very much. Any more questions? Well, we are all very tired after a very long day. I thank you very much for your exchanges, and I wish you all the best. I would like to thank Katerina for her good panel sharing. Thank you very much. To Emmanuel, I don't know if he's here. No, he's not here. And well, you will be kept informed about the next steps. Thank you very much.